this just goes back to like what you're saying is you're observing what's going on in California. And California is a massive state. It's the size of a European country, almost 40 million people. But you've got this going on the other side of the continent, and man, we're living in parallel universes.
Hey everybody, happy Monday. It's Darren again, and we have another interview today. This is our first official returning guest. I spoke again with Jeremy Zogby, who is a pollster at John Zogby Strategies. And I think you'll find from our interview that, Jeremy and I don't see eye to eye on everything. I think that's pretty clear. We have some differences of opinion. But I think he's a straight-up guy, and I appreciate him talking to me. And I think it's always good to get a different perspective about how somebody else might be looking at situations or current events and not get trapped in a self-reinforcing bubble. So we definitely disagree on a number of things, but I think we have good discussions, and I hope you enjoy them. I plan on having him on, I think, about every 3 or 4 months. We'll check in and be talking to Jeremy in the future. So we are joined again by Jeremy Zogby. He is a pollster at John Zogby Strategies and co-host of the podcast, The Zogby Report, Real and Unscripted, which, by the way, I would congratulate you now on, you passed 100 episodes.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah.
We did.
Thank you. Have a new look.
Yeah. The United State of Democracy. And it was really good that we did that on the 101 the first 101st episode, which, by the way, was not planned. We've been, thinking about a new look for a while, and it just happened to be on 101. So we're still real and unscripted, as the old tagline was from the original podcast.
Why don't we get started with something that we were talking about last time? It's been about 5 months. I think It was in August we last talked. And something that was on our mind was the California recall election. So I had predicted going into the recall that it would be defeated by between 5 to 10 points. And if I recall correctly, it was more than 20.
Yep.
So what did you make of that result? I have my own take on it, but I'm kind of interested in your opinion.
Yeah. I mean, looking at the polls in late July and then going into August, you were seeing momentum for about half of the public, almost just shy of half of the public, who would vote yes for a recall. And the storm clouds were gathering. That momentum was being built among public opinion. It was also coinciding with a whole new season of raging wildfires, an explosion in the homeless population, and then there was the prospect of the moratorium on rent, the federal. And so, what was going to happen? Were there going to be more homeless people out on the streets of cities like LA and San Francisco? But I think Newsom, if I recall, he jumped in with some state support so that you wouldn't have that issue. And so, I think that was the first thing that saved him. And then from there, I think just Larry Elder didn't really connect. he had a certain base. I mean, he only, in the polls when it was the first question, vote yes or no. Well, for those who said yes, just under 50%, it was like 15, 16, or 17% went to Larry Elder, who was the most popular choice. So he didn't really have a lot of steam, though you don't need that in the California recall. But I think when it all was said and done, the voters just weren't ready for somebody that they didn't know who had any experience. And I mean, he could certainly talk again. He certainly has expertise in his field of being a political analyst, but the voters, by and large, wanted Newsom. They wanted to keep him.
Yeah, so my take on it is that at the beginning, when it was a closer race, that there was a lot of expressed frustration with Newsom, both obviously among Republicans and people on the right, but criticisms of him from the left as well. And then as we got closer and closer to the actual election, I think people started to take a look at what were really the choices available to them, and they realized that it was basically a choice between Newsom and Elder. And many, many people, the vast majority, are just, how do I say this? Larry Elder's politics just are not popular here at all. It's a very small minority. And I think the people just said,
Yeah.
We just don't want this guy anywhere near the governor's office. Yeah, so I don't think it was so much a confirmation of Newsom's record or anything. I think it was a rejection of Elder, and they also ran their campaign as a kind of an anti-Trump COVID policy. Those are the two big issues on the ads and everything. Was this is a Republican operation that's coming in that's tied to Trump, and this is also a referendum on the COVID policies in California, and so that became part of the larger picture.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think a lot of what we said has some overlap. I would just add to it that at the end of the day, and this is what essentially what you're saying, going over to Elder is a complete 180 on all of the COVID policies. And California, and we're looking at states like New York State, California, and probably Oregon and Washington that are in a category unto themselves regarding mandates and how to deal with COVID-19. And voters in California gave Newsom their support. And although they got frustrated with the lockdowns and some business closures, a lot of business closures, they weren't ready to do that 180.
I mean, there is frustration with some of the policies and the confusion, I guess you could say, over messaging and what's going on. But by and large, in California, even in the more conservative areas, there's not the kind of anti-mask, anti-vaccine sentiment that's super prevalent, I think, in the way that I seem to see it in the rest of the country. When I go around to restaurants or grocery stores or just walking around, a lot of people are masked up. It's not a big deal. Nobody says, what are you doing? Take that off or anything. I mean, it just seems like it's not as much of an issue here as it is in other parts of the country. And there was definitely a lot more acceptance and willingness to go along with the different measures that were taken earlier compared to other parts of the country. So why don't we go over just some general national political stuff as we come into already, as we were saying, as I was talking to you earlier, how the election cycle never seems to end in the United States. We have primaries coming up, then the 22 midterms. So Biden is not in a good place. The Democrats are not in a good place. I see them as
Nope.
They're going to be slaughtered in November. Unless there's some kind of political earthquake or some black swan event that's just going to, completely upend the direction that things are going, I see that they're going to do really bad. They're going to definitely lose the House by wide margins, probably lose the Senate, as well as, all the state elections. Biden's approval rating is very low, and I have some comments about that I wanted to run by you, but I wanted to get your take on that. I'm assuming that you agree with the general sense of what I said, but anything you want to add to that?
Well, that's what our data shows. I mean, we came out with a poll before Christmas, and Biden's approval rating was at 45%. Now there are polls, Quinnipiac. It's a problem when the major polling outfits like Quinnipiac and NBC start showing even lower than that. Of course, this is a month later since what we've come out, but the one Quinnipiac had this week was 33% approve. But back to our poll before Christmas, then we asked the voters, what do you want, a Republican or a Democratic Congress? And it was if I remember, it was 4 or 5 points, a Republican preference, a lead of about 4 or 5 points that voters want this next Congress to be Republican. So I agree with you. It doesn't look well for Biden. It doesn't look well for the party. And there's some reasons, if you've been following over the last year, it should be pretty evident. We can dive into why I think we've seen this turn of the tide.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to get into. So to get into this, maybe ask a general question first.
Mm-hmm.
I've always had a little bit of trouble with approval rating polls. And I'll tell you what my reason is for this. When you ask somebody just a binary, do you approve or disapprove?
Yeah.
You're not really getting any background on their thinking or motivation for their answer. So just give you a general example that I think applies here, but could apply in many other situations. If you have somebody who is, say, center-left politician, they're going to get disapproval for the most part from folks on the right most of the time. And they'll generally get pretty high approval ratings from especially the partisans that are in the party, but also, people who are kind of on that side of the aisle. But the disapproval, you could also have a disapproval rating being given by someone who is kind of on the other side. So, for instance, I personally know a lot of people who would report a disapproval rating for Biden if a pollster asked them, but they would have entirely different reasons than a Republican who says disapproval.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you just have just the numbers, you're just looking at the numbers, I think there's a tendency in the media that when they look at these numbers, they say, well, this means that if, the disapproval is going up and the approval is going down, that they're not happy on this side. And so in order to alleviate this, or in order to get their approval back up, they need to kind of modulate to the center more. And this goes both ways. It goes, if there's a Democrat who's suffering in the approval ratings, they'll say, well, he needs to modulate more, to meet the right, to bring that back into line. And if there's a Republican in office, whether it doesn't have to be the federal level, just anywhere, if they have disapproval ratings, well, they should be moderating more to appeal to the center and left. And it just doesn't seem like it's that as simple to me as that.
Well, I mean, so first off, we do a series of approval ratings. We do overall the presidency, Joe Biden's job as president, Donald Trump's job as, when he was president, we were asking that. And we could do then Joe Biden's approval. Do you approve or disapprove of his handling of COVID-19, of his handling of the supply chain crisis, inflation, whatever you want to do. So you could start out with you have to have an overall. You have to grade somebody on their overall presidency, even though there are different issues that affect different Americans, and Americans have different points of view on, whether it's left or right. But so we cover the gamut by doing his overall presidency and then narrowing it to specific job handlings. But then yes, you're right about the binary, but that's when you write the press release. But when you're surveying the likely voters or whoever is your population that you're surveying, you give them a scale. You give them strongly approve, somewhat disapprove, strongly disapprove, and that's very important because I'm going to cite the polling numbers from the one I'm talking about, where he had a 45 or a 46%. When you combine the strongly approve and the somewhat approve, that was his number, 46%. But then when you looked at the strongly disapprove, that alone was 40%. So now you're getting into intensity. And so you can look at to the level of, a voter saying, well, I strongly approve of Biden, and then X percent saying, I somewhat approve. But then now when you go on the other side of the scale and you see that the strongly disapprove almost matched the weight or the combination of the somewhat and strongly approve, now you can see that there's a real problem, and you can see where that's coming from. You can see that demographically. So that's obviously going to be becoming from largely Republicans and conservatives. You're not going to have too many Democrats.
I'm not sure about that. A lot of progressives and people on the left strongly disapprove of Biden. I mean, maybe you have data that says otherwise. That's just anecdotally.
There are people. I'm just saying, like, when we're all right. Well, here, how about this? I'm going to pull up the data so we can see what percents among Democrats and even ideology strongly disapprove. I'm almost there. All right, among Democrats, looking at it by party, only 10% somewhat disapprove, and only 7% strongly disapprove. And like we're going to agree, those are especially going to come from those who would have voted for Bernie had Bernie got the nomination, right? And I think that's what you were getting at.
Yes, and are independents included in this, or are they separate? Sometimes they'll take independents and say, "Are you independent but Democrat leaning?"
Yeah, we screen. No, we do. One of our upfront questions in the survey is, how do you identify as party? And it's Democrat, Republican, independent, or unaffiliated. Is we just label that independent, and the independent breakdown is 42% strongly disapprove, 18% somewhat disapprove. So you have there's rounding it off, there's 61% of independents overall, combining somewhat and strongly disapprove. 60%.
I think that might include a lot of Bernie people as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt that. And so to go back to our conversation on, kind of seeing what's going on here and why we know, not only just from the overall, just looking at what you see in the headlines, when you get down into that level, the two data points I just shared, the strongly disapprove number overall being at 40-something%, and then looking at independents and seeing a combined disapproval rating of 61%. Basically, what you're seeing is independents today are looking a little bit more like MAGA voters. They're very much tired of Biden. They went too far. Now, how can I prove that? Just look to Virginia. Virginia right now, and what almost happened in New Jersey, is still very relevant at this moment in terms of the momentum going into 2022 that is in favor of the Republicans. The Democrats in the Virginia gubernatorial elections lost independents. That's where Biden won strong in the presidential election. He won a lot of the independents, And now he's losing a lot of them. And a lot of people are saying Virginia's a bellwether. And then we can look at a case study to go to the next level. Blue New Jersey, it has had a Republican governor, but, New Jersey is pretty solidly blue. They almost went to the Republicans. In fact, one of the seat of the most powerful state senator was lost to a former truck driver named Steve Sweeney. Steve Sweeney spent $10,000 on his campaign. If you were to ask him, how were you so successful and at the same time spending so little funds to oust the most powerful state senator in the state, he said, it's simple. I ran my campaign based on the premise that now the politicians are messing with our families. If they want to raise taxes, we'll put up with that. If they want to cut programs, we'll put up with that. But once you start messing with people's families, and he's talking about something very specific. He's talking about parents being harassed for showing up at school board hearings or meetings of the superintendent. In some cases, the FBI, sitting in on those and claiming that they're domestic extremists, terrorists. He's also talking about vaccine mandates. He's talking about critical race theory, imposing this in schools. And so the Republican strategy in Virginia and in New Jersey was really all about all politics are local. And Democrats over this last year have failed because they've been so fixated on things like Build Back Better. And they really put a lot of their eggs in that basket of the Green New Deal, the Build Back Better, whatever you want to call it. And that's not speaking to people's day-to-day lives. Yeah, that's looking 20, 30 years into the future. But with crippling inflation and with the prospect of radical teachings being taught in your child's school and the prospect of, hey, your kid might not be able to attend school unless he has one of the vaccines, the Republicans saw an opening on that. And all politics is local. They went with that old adage.
So those are the issues that you would cite are what's bringing down Biden's approval rating and why the Republicans are look to be in such a good spot going into 22.
Inflation, coupled with the Democrats focusing on reducing carbons and green infrastructure and a bill that's in the trillions. And so while they're talking about passing a bill in the trillions that, can't even get enough support from the Democrats, people are going to the stores, people are going to the gas pumps, and they're noticing a major, major difference. And for the first time, there was a poll, for the first time in quite a long time, voters cite inflation as the number one concern over COVID-19.
Listening to you talk, it is interesting because it's getting into something else I was going to talk about. It almost sounds like it's a different country when I hear you talking about these issues.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see things like vax mandates and critical race theory and the kind of, these kind of cultural wedge issues that you're talking about. It's just not a big deal here. School board meetings and stuff.
Yeah.
I just don't see it. It's like when I see it on TV, it's like, this is something happening out in America.
It's not your country.
It's like I'm looking at politics in a foreign country.
Yeah.
I'm just telling you, what, compared to my own experience and, as a Californian.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I look at the critical race theory to me, and you might disagree with this, but I look at this as something like the Republicans like to gin up issues going into midterms. There was one of the midterms where they it was all about Sharia law. Like that was the kind of a driving thing. They would get, the U.S. is going into Sharia law. We're going to have, Islamic law being imposed on us and stuff.
Yeah.
These kind of ridiculous things. And that's kind of how I look at CRT. I see it as kind of a cultural wedge issue that's used to manipulate people to drive out turnout in the midterms.
Well, I mean, obviously perception is reality, right? And so how you perceive the world. And so you perceive the world in California, and I can definitely see that in California. People are probably, thinking more about COVID-19 and getting the numbers down and returning to normal by, strictly adhering to these measures, as well as healthcare, universal healthcare. Well, no, that still is a pretty quintessential, liberal and progressive policy. And then also, probably like, hey, when are we going to get green infrastructure? When are we going to really get closer to net zero carbon? And that's all true. That's all true in California. But in battleground states and swing states, whether it's Michigan, whether it's Wisconsin, whether it's Virginia, North Carolina, it can go either way. And yes, there are things that are really riling up the Republicans. Now, how much of that is just ginned up, as you said, kind of like the example of the, Sharia law? Well, if you go to Loudoun County and you talk to people, suburban mothers, that's going to be a very important subgroup in these coming elections, are suburban mothers who care about their kids' schooling, who care about their kids' overall welfare, and then the parents go to express a basic right, a basic civic, behavior of, hey, I want my voice heard, and then you have, lo and behold, the FBI in the hearings. You can imagine that the Republicans don't really have that much to gin up, and so that became a front and center issue because, and the reason why I mentioned inflation and Build Back Better is because that's the perfect backdrop. We're talking about a context. Again, we're talking about, say, like suburban mothers and parents who care about their kids' future. And the Democratic Party is talking about what they're talking about in Glasgow, which I think the media, revealed COP26, that was a failure. But the Democratic Party is talking about these things, and yet people are dealing with these things on the ground, prices going up and having to fear their voices being heard. And so you raise an excellent question as to how real is all of that, but it goes back to perception is reality. And I think the lesson from it all is that it's more of it's going into 2022. It's going to be less about academic stuff, net zero carbon societies and green infrastructure. These are things that I think are more discussed among the academics and less so when it comes to your average voter who's just trying to get ahead, who's just trying to collect a check and put food on the table.
Well, maybe that's because it hasn't hit them yet, like it has us here. Because we're dealing with it now. We have wildfires, drought, all this weather stuff. It's not an abstract thing for us.
No, absolutely not. But this just goes back to like what you're saying is you're observing what's going on in California. And California is a massive state. It's the size of a European country, almost 40 million people. But you've got this going on the other side of the continent, and man, we're living in parallel universes.
This is kind of the main, one of the main things I wanted to talk about is that the divisions, we were talking about the divisions in the country earlier, and there's different ways you can think about how people are divided. You can talk about people being divided on policy, like I favor more tax cuts. I, want more spending on this. I'm on this way on abortion. I have this kind of policy on guns, and so on. Then you can have divisions that are along kind of social and cultural lines, which I think has been happening for a long time. We listen to different radio stations or radio shows. We watch different TV shows. There's different social media universes. Go to different restaurants and so on. I mean, that's a real thing. And then now we've approached a division even beyond that. It seems to me, as what you were saying, that there's almost two alternate universes.
Yeah.
In one universe, Joe Biden lost the election and Trump won and it was stolen from him.
Yeah.
And what happened on January 6th was peaceful protesters, or was Antifa or the FBI or who knows what, where COVID isn't important, or it is important if immigrants have it or whatever. And the most important issues, as you were saying, are things like critical race theory and mandates and this kind of stuff. And in another universe, Biden won the election. January 6th was something that we really need to look into. There was a coup attempt. COVID is something important that we need to think about. And so it just seems like there's these two parallel realities, and that seems really troubling, because if you're not agreeing on a common set of facts and the common set of evidence about what's even happening in the world, I don't see how you move on from that. I mean, because at least if you agree on what's occurring, you can at least agree to disagree. You can say, okay, we see this and we understand this is what's happening, and this is my take and this is your take, and we can try and convince each other, and we end up disagreeing and we move on and fight another day. But when you don't even agree on, recent historical events, or you don't even agree on basic facts, you don't trust the same news sources, you don't trust the same people, you dismiss anything out of hand that is from the other side. I don't see where you go from there. That seems like a very deep division that, even in the Civil War, the Democrats accepted that Lincoln won the election, right? I mean, they didn't like it. They said, we're not going to accept this in the sense that we don't want to put up with this. But they did acknowledge, he actually did win. Whereas the majority, something like, 65, 70% of Republicans will literally believe that the election was stolen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, let's be fair, because I'm going to be objective here. And I don't know why the Democrats get exonerated for their behavior in 2016, but to me it was just as awful. You could say, how could you say that, Jeremy? Look at January 6th. Well, January 6th could very well go down in textbook history, right? I could see it going down in textbook history. But you can't deny the fact that following 2016, there became a literally 24/7 campaign from the first minute to undermine the newly elected President Trump. Now, look, I'm not even. I'm going to pause right now. I'm going to say to everybody, I haven't even voted since 2012. I'm not even on the voter list. Like, it's not even that I'm independent, unaffiliated. I'm not even on the voter list. So I don't even have a dog in this fight. I just know exactly what I saw as somebody who values objectivity. There was a 24/7 campaign blitz every day, even on holidays, even on Sundays, to undermine the president and say that he was falsely elected. The Democrats shot themselves in the foot by carrying that for 4 years. So does it surprise you that Republicans would contest the next election when so much energy went into 2020, those 4 years leading up, saying he was illegitimate, saying he was a Russian puppet? They undermined democracy. And now the Republicans, it's like for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Then the Republicans, they said, all right, the playbook's already been written. We can deny it too. And so it's really both of them, and that's not to you. That's just to the listeners, that we have a fundamental crisis of confidence in the system. We have to ask ourselves, where does this come from? And I'm sure it's a very complex thing, but off the top of my head, it coincides with a dangerous trend that we see in corporate media as a network, as well as big tech, social media platforms. And that is shutting out the debate and deeming only certain things, being able to talk about. And so it's happening in the liberal and the left news, and the same thing is happening on the right. I mean, Fox News upheld Donald Trump like he was the savior, although everything that he campaigned on, he went against. He said he was going to drain the swamp. He increased the swamp. He brought in people like John Bolton and Pompeo. These were CIA, national security top dogs. Yet he said he was going to go easy on the war rhetoric, and he didn't really do that. And so what I'm saying is, corporate media, both on the right and on the left, and both in the networks and in the social media platforms, are what they're doing is they're making it so that they're narrowing what's the allowable opinion and what can be discussed and what can be debated, and anything that doesn't fit the mold is chastised and casted aside. But if you believe in a free country, then you have to believe in a marketplace of ideas. And you have to, if you believe in a marketplace of ideas, it's because there has to be public discourse. There has to be a loop of feedback going back and forth where everyone can jump in. And even the extreme elements jump in, but there's conversation, and eventually people work it out. But these platforms and networks aren't allowing that. They're molding from the top down what is the standard thought on the left and what is the standard on the right. And that's why we only see these two parallel universes. There should be room for a lot more debate. And I think it also has to do with our two-party system, that eventually having this two-party system for 100 years was going to run its course and was going to bring us to the extremes. So I think you put those two together, and that's kind of like the dynamic of why we're in this crisis of confidence.
Yeah, your point about 2016 is well taken, and I'm not going to defend. There's a fair amount of conspiracy theorizing and wild theories that were put about for a while there after Trump's election. I do think that the Republicans have taken it to a qualitatively different level.
Well, truthfully, I don't think it matters. I don't think it matters. And if we could actually scale it, and you're a mathematician, if we could actually find a way to rate it and index it or whatever, it just wouldn't even matter because it's already happened 2 times.
So I see what you're saying. But, I mean, to me, one of the overriding issues now is that we're learning more and more about what was essentially a seditious conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government. And it's complete denial on the right. There's not even any acknowledgement of it. And I don't know what this is going to come to, but I don't see how there can be such differing opinions or such differing interpretations of such a fundamental event as that. And there's really 2 big issues that are animating, at least from my point of view, people on the left. When I say the left, I don't necessarily mean just Democrats. I mean leftists. Is the failure to have really any kind of real accountability for this coup attempt that happened last year, this attempt to overthrow the government. They've kind of we've gotten up to the Oath Keepers or whatever they are, but they really haven't got the head of the snake yet. And so there's real frustration that they're really not going far enough and really getting to some prosecutions and accountability for these people. The other big thing is Biden's agenda just stalling, especially with voting rights. A lot of frustration with that is not being done. That Manchin and Sinema are holding that up, and a lot of frustration with the the Build Back Better. Bernie ran on, I don't know how many $1 trillion he ran on over 10 years for the different programs that he was proposing. He kind of brought Biden to the left. Biden ran in his campaign, I believe, on $6 trillion over 10 years. Then when he came into office, he said, okay, I'm going to propose this $3.5 trillion. So from the point of view of progressives and the left, the $3.5 trillion was already a compromise. That was we came from 10 or 12 to 6 to 3.5. It's like, we've already come this way. So when you go to 1.75, that was just completely unacceptable. And there's a lot of frustration that he wasn't able to get this through. And they see it as a betrayal. We see it as a betrayal that he didn't fight for enough. I guess this is just to highlight the completely different kind of viewpoints or perceptions that people have. On the right, like I'll turn on. I watch right wing news and talk shows and radio and TV shows and stuff, and from them, like the 1.5 trillion or something like that, the kind of scaled down Build Back Better is akin to communism and Bolshevism and whatever. This guy Stalin reincarnated. And the voting rights is an invasion of the federal government into state sovereignty, and they're taking over the election apparatus. And on the left, the paltry or the amount that's being proposed now is compromised already from a compromised position, and the fact that we're not probably going to get anything out of the soft infrastructure bill is seen as just a betrayal. And then the voting rights, the failure to get the voting rights through, is seen as endangering democracy and really threatening a takeover of the election system by the Republicans. So, regardless of how you perceive, on those two ends, those are completely different perceptions of events.
Yeah. And the scary thing, the sad thing is this is all because of party loyalty, party allegiance. To an extent, there's a debate about the issue, but when I hear what you're breaking down, it just reveals to me the extent that the public is approaching this from their party allegiance perspective of, these are our issues, this is what we represent, this is what we need to ram through, it's our turn. But, George Washington warned us about party allegiance, and we're actually living it. We're living his warning. This is it. This is the result of everything he was trying to tell us, that political parties are not religion. He didn't say these words, but this is my interpretation. Political parties are not religions. They're not cults. They certainly get people riled up and get the support like religions and cults do. But it's all about the issues. It's all about the philosophy of how should we be governed. The only way, if we want to approach this in a civilized manner, our only way forward is to go back to the principles of government, which were laid out by the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. I'm not talking about going back to, debating the issues of slavery. I'm talking about what is the relationship between the federal government and the state government, the system of checks and balances. And you and I were laughing about the fact that, it seems like every year we're in election season. Well, that's how James Madison set it up. And truthfully, I don't think that's a dated thing from the 18th century. He was taking wisdom over the centuries. I mean, the Founding Fathers were flawed people, but they knew ancient history, and they knew medieval history, and they knew the history of what were republican governments and what were democracies. And they understood, especially James Madison, that you had to have an elaborate system of checks and balances. And so the midterm elections were great for that, to ensure that the executive branch wouldn't get too much power. Because if we didn't have this midterm election and it was pushed into 2024, who knows what would happen. But that's why anytime a party or a candidate starts to get some headway, the Constitution has these built-in checks and balances to ensure that there isn't this oversweep or the tyranny of the majority. And so we're losing sight of a lot of this stuff, and we're falling prey to the wild passions of the political parties, but we're really forgetting about the principles of what this country was founded on. I think the only civil way out is to rediscover that and reinfuse that into the political debate. I don't think it's going to happen.
I also think there are structural issues that the founders could not have conceived, or would be very unlikely for them to conceive, that have taken place, especially demographics of the states, the relative size of the states. I don't think that they could have had in mind that there would be such a difference between them. They had small states and big states, but they didn't have Wyoming and California. I don't think they had that in mind.
Well, no, I mean, but they had Virginia, and Virginia was huge, and that's how we got, the Great Compromise. I mean, I'm of the mindset that, and so this is getting beyond history and into philosophy and political theory, but I mean, I'm of the mindset that certain principles are timeless, regardless of the technological changes. And there were certain things in what the founding fathers were talking. Slavery, obviously, not being one of them. That was a gross, something that a lot of them couldn't see past. But other principles are timeless, and it doesn't matter whether we're in, an economy based on software or an industrial society. There are certain governing principles that they saw from studying history going way back, and that still apply to today. And that's obviously, broadly speaking, one of them is the whole notion of checks and balances.
So just one more thing about, and I agree with what you're saying, just one more thing about perceptions, for instance, with checks and balances. I hear Republicans say when they're talking about the filibuster, they talk about it as this rule that is to prevent the majority from running roughshod over the minority. And just if you look at it from the point of view of a Californian, and I'm just going to run some numbers here, already with a 50-50 split Senate, the Democrats in the Senate represent 55% of the population and Republicans 44%. So there's an 11% split when it's 50-50. That's not even counting the filibuster. If you total the 20 and a half least populous states, and I know not all of those are Republican controlled, so in reality it's a little bit more than this, but in principle, if you take the 20 and a half least populous states, it is possible for 11% it's possible for senators representing 11% of the U.S. population to halt any legislation in Congress against the 89%. And for a lot of Californians, that's just intolerable. It's like, okay, checks and balances is fine, but 89-11, come on. What's going on here? Can you see how that could get under how that could get under somebody's skin?
Sure. But I mean, historical interpretation is key here. I think the founders, they knew laws had to be made through the legislative process. But what you're talking about, that one example of a check is, well, we don't need to over-legislate, because I believe it was Cicero, the famous Roman Senate, who said more laws, less justice. The more stuff that you restrict, you're actually becoming less of a just society. Now, I'm not applying that particularly to Build Back Better and the $3.5 trillion package. I'm just saying that to me, that check makes sense because, let me put it simpler. If it were the flip side and the Republicans were dominant and they wanted to pass something that the Democrats, didn't find pleasing, a very similar or analogous situation can take place. Thank God.
If the Republicans had majority support for something 55%, I think they should be able to implement their agenda.
Mm-hmm. But if there's a tiny little percentage of Democrats that want to stop that, aren't they entitled to?
Like 10% that want to stop it?
Yeah.
No, I don't think 10% should be able to stop a majority of 55, 60%. I don't.
Well, now I would say that you're consistent.
My position would be, you fight them as much as you can and make your case. And, maybe through other means you can try and attenuate what they're doing, and you go out and fight the next election.
Well, I mean, that's going to happen regardless of the filibuster or not. So, I mean, the Republicans shoot themselves in the foot. So, I mean, that's kind of what we're dealing with here, is that no party can really dominate, nor should they dominate. But in the final analysis of this topic, it just goes back to what we agree on, that this is deep. This is woven into our culture and not only our politics. And we really have to get away from this. And if we don't, we shouldn't expect anything good. We can't go on much longer like this.
To wrap up, I wanted to ask you about something about media. We talked about when will we know that issue about, say, secession, independence, these kind of things that we've been talking about for a while. How do we know when that will really be something that's in the mainstream discourse? And it seemed to me that there was a kind of a tipping point a few weeks to a couple months ago where there was just a flurry of articles about secession and independence and civil war and all these kind of issues that were just one after the other in every major newspaper and cable show and magazines and journals and stuff. Did you notice that, or did you agree that there was some kind of penetration about that topic?
That's the $1 million question. Is when does it go viral? Does it go viral? And what does it look like? I don't know if it's going to go viral. I'm not going to say it's not. I just don't know.
Is there a difference between getting into mainstream coverage and going viral?
Well, yeah, actually, I wasn't even realizing that, but thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, they are. Basically, one is bottom up and one is top down, right? Viral is, well, depending on, actually, maybe that's not so true with all the algorithms, right? That YouTube and other social media platforms have. But, putting that aside, the one is through on the ground people liking something and sharing it, and then it explodes, versus going through the gatekeepers in the news of the news who filter out what we get to see. And so I guess from the bottom up, I don't think it's really, there are pockets of it around the country, certainly California, Texas, New Hampshire, probably some other places, but yeah, I mean, you see it more being covered in the news because of polls that are coming out, which I guess you could say is also bottom up, right? Because those results are based on coming from the people. But it's just right now, it's hard for me to see with all that's going on. It's hard for me to see that issue becoming like in the forefront. It will when one state starts to really go that way. And that's all it's going to take is one state. And if I were to guess, I would think you would see the most sentiment coming from Texas. But but I just don't know how far, like I haven't seen a poll of Texans. I've only seen these nationwide polls. I haven't seen by state. So it's really hard to say.
And I agree with you that it will take some kind of a catalyst event, which would be something like a referendum in a state like Texas, where they start to get more serious, and that would be a catalyst for that kind of viral coverage. And I think that as we get closer and closer to 2024 election, that'll start to be more of an issue, because I just see the 2024 election as it's going to come to a point where somebody's not going to be happy.
Oh, yeah. Let me just say this. Secession is probably like the last-ditch effort. Before secession, you've got nullification. Now, we, of course, have seen the revival of nullification, especially recently with to an extent with COVID-19. I mean, the mandates on the vaccines really only apply to the who falls under the executive, Joe Biden. But I mean, you saw like these states and kind of like banded together saying, we're going to reject whatever federal measures come out about of course, Ron DeSantis and Governor Abbott doing their reverse executive orders. But I think you're going to see a lot more of that in the spirit of nullification leading up to 2024. And when that fails, or like you said, something is going on the ground in a state like Texas where they actually get a referendum through, of course, then they have the next hoop to get over is to actually have a majority pass it. That's when you're in even more extraordinary times. How about we close on a potentially positive note that I've been polling on reform issues, and so believe it or not, there actually are things that most Americans, and when I say most, I mean like a supermajority, can get behind. And a bunch of some of the questions I asked were on term limits for Congress and Senate, as well as term limits for federal bureaucrats. We don't usually associate that with federal bureaucrats, but when you look at people like Henry Kissinger or Brzezinski, or Tony Fauci, people who've been in government for nearly 50 years, it's kind of crazy. But another reform I talked about was, police have to wear body cams in some jurisdictions. What about the notion of high-level federal bureaucrats having to wear body cams? I mean, more and more people are starting to associate them with unaccountable and non-transparent, and campaign finance reform. So let me just go through the litany. About 90% of Americans can get behind term limits for Congress and Senate, and almost as many for high-level or for federal bureaucrats. So that's something that we can get on board with. That's something we can agree. The question on body cams for high-level federal bureaucrats, it was in the high 70s. I think it was 77% said they would support that. And then the last one was removing corporate PAC money from campaign elections. That was in the high 80s. So there are things that we can talk about. They're just not being put front and center. There are things that we can agree on in droves. They're just not put front and center. And of course, our candidates don't jump on them. They jump on the more divisive issues. So I want to leave you with that prospect of reform because it's wildly popular. And I want to leave you on the prospect of the potential. There is the potential for a unifying figure to come on the scene, or at least somebody within both parties that tries to unify their party and then makes overtures to cross over. I think that's possible. I don't think it's all just blood and battle on the political field.
Well, that's a good note to end on. I'll just say I think you're a little more optimistic than me, but I don't want to spoil that optimism at the moment, so I won't say. So thanks again for coming on, and it was a really great conversation again, and hopefully we'll have you back on. I'm thinking maybe every 2 or 3 months or so, just to check in on what you think's going on and any new polling results to talk about and that kind of stuff.
I'll always have new information, especially if you give me that length of time, and I'd love to come on a third time. I look forward to it, and I'm glad that you and I are demonstrating how civil discourse should be taken. I'm sure we have very different viewpoints, but look how enlightening it can be when we talk like this.
Thanks again. Talk to you later.
Thanks so much. Yeah, take care, Darren.